This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Throughout history, humankind has found ways to modify and adorn themselves, allowing for unique identification within their tribe and society as a whole, and taking comfort in shared activities with their family and friends and their community. And this has never been more popular than it is today, with various piercings, tattoos, tanning, and more being part of the pop culture of today's environment. Vaping has also found favor with this demographic, and while all of these things may pose health risks to the individual, we must also consider the risks which may be inherent to some of these trends. So on this episode, we will speak with Dr. Tim Sandle about the potential risks to clean rooms and laboratories posed by some of today's fads. So welcome, Tim. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back again.
Yeah, this is such a timely and really interesting topic. And I know you've been doing some research into some of these trends and their possible impact in labs. So let's start by talking about the expectations for laboratory personnel in terms of hygiene and contamination. And can you give us a brief overview of the regulations as they apply to hygiene?
Yes, both FDA and European Medicines Agency have quite clear guidelines on hygiene for working in laboratories and for going into clean rooms. There's requirement for things like annual health checks and for people to report particular conditions. So, for example, people are required to wear face masks, for example. If they have coughs or they're sneezing, then that will weaken the mask. And although all masks become weaker over time, that process gets speeded up if the mask becomes wet, for example. So it's important that personnel are reporting in these particular factors.
Thank you. And so obviously it's important for clean room managers to assess the health of personnel. But what methods are currently being used to do this? And would you say it's effective?
I think it varies. I think, looking at the topic that we're talking about is that a number of companies have procedures that are a little bit old. So they might say, if you've got a cold or flu, then don't go into the clean room. I've said about masks, but if you're feverish, then also that can affect the integrity of the clean room suit. And generally, it's been established for a while that if somebody is on antibiotics or antimicrobials, then they can do things like weaken the skin microbiome, lead to excessive shedding, or release more microbial carrying particles. And a number of companies might do health checks at shift handover, or they run annual medicals and so on. But I think it's when we spoke in the intro about the changes in society and things like tattoos becoming more popular and so on, that a lot of companies haven't necessarily caught up with the current fads and the current trends, and there needs to be a bit of an adjustment to meet those changes.
Sure. So anybody working in a laboratory then would expect the normal health check from the manager, right? So if you have a cold or the flu or something else going on, they would expect to get called out on that, but not necessarily for any of these other things that we're going to talk about today.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So as you mentioned, tattoos are increasing in popularity. What general concerns do these present, for individuals, and what about specific clean room risks?
Okay, well, I think with tattoos, there are three things to consider. One is skin damage. The other one is infection around the tattoo site. And then the third one are risks relating to tattoo ink. And there's some surveys which are showing levels of contamination in tattoo ink. So if we look at skin damage first, then obviously the act of having the tattoo can cause damage to the skin. There's going to be a certain period of healing, which can be from days to weeks, depending upon the type of tattoo and the extent of the skin as well. But there's also some research to say that certain colours of tattoo will cause more skin damage than others. And this happens because certain pigments can react with ultraviolet light, in particular sunlight, and cause greater extent of damage. And that's been shown with tattoos that are red or similar colours. So where pigments that are red, purple, pink, orange and so on, they appear to cause more problems compared with other colours, particularly when they react with sunlight. And
Very
also,
interesting.
As well as the
Is that long term, Tim, or just like when they're in the stages of healing?
No, there's some impact about long-term slow release damage as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then as well as the act of having the tattoo done, if anyone undergoes a tattoo removal process, then equally that can cause some blistering and the skin becoming crusty, and also some skin pigment changes. Then the second area, so that's skin damage. Second area is with infection, and this is where any microorganisms on the outer layers of the skin or from the environment might find their way into the body during the healing process of the tattoo. It also stands that the entry of the needle can sometimes transfer environmental contamination through the needle or directly from the tattooist as well, because we have to acknowledge that most tattoo artists are not healthcare professionals when it comes to aseptic technique.
Right.
And then the third point is that there's been a few surveys emerging. Most of these have come out in the last 2 or 3 years, and they're looking at the microbiological contamination of tattoo inks. Now, there's a great variety depending upon different manufacturers, different countries, and so on. But one review, which was fairly comprehensive, found that about 10% of bottles of tattoo ink are contaminated. And then when those bottles are reused, then that rate can increase to close to 20%. Now, of course, just because the bottle is contaminated doesn't necessarily mean that the person receiving the tattoo will become infected. But here the same survey was saying that, okay, if you imagine that between 10 and 20% of the bottles are contaminated, if one of those bottles is used, then the risk of infection is between around 0.5 to 6% of people. And in terms of the most common types of contaminants, then species of bacillus, which is a spore-forming microorganism, accounts for around half of the contamination. And that's of potential clinical significance, because it can then lead to skin infections. And then in terms of specific risks to the clean room, then you can get things like dermatitis, excessive itching, a greater shedding of particles can occur as well. So there's a number of specific risks as well as the risks to the individual.
So in addition to the tattoos, then, are there other skin conditions that might present a concern as far as the clean room goes? Because I hear you talking about, shedding extra skin or cells, maybe carrying some of the contaminant. I don't know if that comes through the pores or what happens, but what other skin conditions might be a concern in addition to the tattooing?
Yeah, so really it's forms of dermatitis and standard eczema, particularly atopic dermatitis, which is the classic form of eczema. So that's when the skin becomes red, starts to become itchy, there's a slight evidence of inflammation, and that causes more skin cells to be shed from the body. And there was some research done by a guy called Bill White from the University of Glasgow, and he said that around 20% of bits of skin shed will be carrying microorganisms, typically around 4 microorganisms per piece of skin matter. So the more of those that are coming off, then that's going to present a challenge for clean rooms and how well the suit works. And then also there can be a greater association with the bacterium Staphylococcus aureus, which is also antibiotic resistant, so there's a link to the whole MRSA. And it's been found that those people who are unfortunate to be suffering from eczema have a higher proportion of this S. aureus organism compared with unaffected individuals. There can also be risks from sun tanning, which can promote excessive skin shedding as well and create itching, and also things like hair extensions, which can increase the microbial load because some of the extensions are not particularly hygienic in themselves, and also things like nail extensions as well, although the biggest risk they can pose is actually piercing the glove as well, because some of these can be quite sharp.
But they can carry, I've heard a lot about nail extensions, like they're just a bed for different contaminants to get stuck under there. You can't necessarily, unless you're using a scrub brush or some other very aggressive form of cleaning, which you may do going into a clean room. But I know just in everyday life, I've heard that can be a source of contamination. Especially like for nurses, as an example, they don't allow nurses to have nail extensions for that reason. So that does make sense.
Yeah, or ask people to remove them, which is not easy, but yeah, you shouldn't really take that stuff into a clean room.
Right. Excellent. And another trend which has gained favor over the past decade that kind of ties into this is body piercings all over the body. Can you talk about those a little bit, about the potential to pose risk inside the clean room? And I imagine there are some things that are similar to the nail extensions and the hair extensions, but I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah. So I think, again, the medical evidence does say that the complications that arise are generally similar to tattoos, although you can get probably more risk of inflammation or reddening of the skin. And the risk seems to vary according to the site of the piercing and the way that piercing has been undertaken, and the number of times the skin might be broken. But there's also some quite erratic practices by different people who carry out piercing. So in terms of the site, the other thing to bear in mind is that the healing time is quite long. Now, this doesn't always mean it's going to present a risk to the clean room, but in some cases it can. So like even with a simple thing like an ear piecing, that can take up to 6 weeks to properly heal. And any wound that's healing then can have risk of infection, risk of shedding, and so on. And then just an example in terms of locations. Apparently when there's ear piercings further up on the earlobe, they're harder to heal and can be more aggressive than ear piercings that are down towards the bottom part of the ear. So, we have the different traumas around healing and the risks of shedding as well. And then also I think the other thing is particularly with tongue piercings, which can lead to a particularly high level of infection. That's often because unsterilised instruments are used for that purpose. And in a lot of places, tattoo parlours are also offering piercing services, but the level of hygiene with piercings should be much, much higher. So we do have this variation in standards, and not being critical. I mean, you can go to like very good salons, and I'm sure the people there carrying out the piercings are highly trained, but equally you're going to get some other places where the level of training and education and hygiene standards are going to be quite weak. And to put these two things into context, there was a survey conducted in the US, and it did say that across the board, complications arising from piercings were around 40%. Now, obviously, there's going to be a scale of that. There's going to be some that are more severe. And with tattoos, that was about 30%. So there it was indicating that the complications from piercings, are generally higher than those of tattoos. There's also a risk of, going back to the cleanroom context, of piercings coming out. And I did hear of one company which is where somebody had a nose stud, and they noticed it had gone, and it actually ended up into a vessel of product. So that caused all sorts.
Yeah, right. And we see a lot of different facial piercings, at least here in the US. I don't know about in the UK, but with the eyebrows and the nose and the cheek and the lip. And a lot of those do not have backings on them necessarily, or they have a different type of backing than what you see on an earring. And I think that could be a definite risk of like it falling out and it just getting lost and whatever you're doing, which obviously has a significant impact on the quality of the product.
Yeah, most definitely.
So Tim, let's turn to another trending topic, which is vaping. And many people are taking up vaping as a means to move away from tobacco products, which is hopefully a good thing if it can help them kick that habit. But are there any microbiological concerns with these types of products?
Yes, there are. Yeah, with both vaping products and with e-cigarettes, which are fairly similar in that they're both using a liquid product which is turned into a vape. But in terms of the microbiological risks, these kind of centre on bacterial endotoxin and with beta-glucan. So endotoxin is a substance of the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria. It's a complex called lipopolysaccharide, and it can then exert a powerful biological response modifier, which then serves to stimulate the immune system, and that can trigger fever or endotoxic shock. And it's known from studies on air pollution that if people are breathing in high levels of endotoxin, as you then might through a vaping product, then that can cause breathing difficulties, and if somebody has asthma, can exacerbate those conditions. With beta-glucans, then these are the most abundant polysaccharides that make up the cell walls of fungi, and there's certainly evidence that they can also trigger immune suppression and also lead to respiratory problems. And both of these risks have been recognised in the US by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So the CDC have a whole raft of emerging standards on e-cigarette and vaping product use associated lung injury. And some of that's also been reported into various academic studies. So there was a study conducted by researchers from Harvard University, and here they took 37 vape cartridges and 38 e-liquid products, and they found that in most of these, endotoxin and the glucan, the fungal byproduct, were present. So 23% of these products, I've taken from a range of different manufacturers, were found to have bacterial endotoxin in them, and 81%, which is quite a huge figure, were found to have levels of glucan in, and in both cases these were beyond the limit of detection, so of potential to cause harm to some users under some circumstances.
Sure. In all your research, did you note if any types of non-tobacco products posed a bigger risk than others?
Yeah, it was actually with this same Harvard study, because they looked at those products that were kind of mimicking like a tobacco tasting aroma product, those that were menthol, and then those that were classified more into the sort of fruit or bubblegum type flavours. And it was found that the products that try and mimic the tobacco or menthol flavours had higher levels of the fungal byproducts, and also that cartridge-based products tended to be higher as well. And I think the reason for that comes down to where the ingredients of some of the products are sourced from. So if they're using a lot of agricultural byproducts, so like tobacco plants, for example, or sometimes also with the if there's cotton wicks in some of the cartridges, then these origins, coupled with perhaps weaker manufacturing conditions, because there's not much in the way of regulation over the manufacture, could make some of the more natural sounding products having higher microbial levels than some of the more fruity ones. But the trouble with some of the fruit flavoured ones is that there's also a risk there that some of those chemicals themselves might be more harmful. So, but from the microbial perspective, it's the tobacco simulated ones and the menthol simulated ones.
Sure. And so there's the potential then for users of these e-cigarettes, et cetera, to come in contact with these toxins just by way of using them. But in addition to that, studies have also shown that tobacco users, both cigarette smokers and vapors, are more susceptible to contracting infections in general. So even looking beyond the toxins, which may be present in vape liquids, what risk may be associated with these heightened infections that individuals, may be carrying around or coming in contact with?
Yeah, there certainly is sufficient evidence that there is lung weakening, acute lung inflammation, and it's not only then if the vape product is contaminated, it makes the individual more susceptible, but the individual then is also more susceptible to other diseases as well. So smokers tend to attract or tend to get a higher number of diseases, be that things like coughs or bacterial infections, far more frequently than non-smokers. Of course, that's a very general point. There's going to be obviously individuals in different groups who don't fall within that, but as a general trend, then that weakening does pose greater risks.
And of course, bringing this back to the clean room, as we have that sort of the underlying, the impact that all of these trends have on the clean room is that if people are presenting with some sort of respiratory infection, they're more likely to be coughing and sneezing, et cetera, and that directly impacts their job in the clean room. Yes?
Yeah, absolutely. And also there's been studies to show that when people have used vape or traditional tobacco products, that the number of particles that they exhale is far, far greater. So that also presents greater challenges to clean room masks and might lead to the mask not lasting for quite so long. And I do know that some facilities say that if you have smoked a cigarette or taken a vaping product, then they would prefer it that you wait 20 minutes before you go through the clean room changing procedure.
So yeah, people aren't just sneaking out to take a quick smoke break and pop right back in, right?
That could cause troubles, yeah.
So, but that is interesting. That leads into another question that I had for you, because you're talking about exhaling particles from these cigarettes, whatever form they are smoking. And I've heard some reports about vaping products potentially spreading the coronavirus. As the delivery method uses vapor, it is conceivable that then the aerosols could potentially carry coronavirus to others in proximity of the vaping activities or just following the vaping activities. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, and there's actually there's a little bit of division within the scientific opinion on that. Now, with spreading coronavirus in general, then there's a lot of evidence emerging now that the air droplets is accounting for about 90% of the cases compared to contaminated surfaces that people might touch. So it's much more, there's much greater risk by people speaking, coughing, sneezing, breathing in close proximity to somebody else, which kind of where the social distancing measures come in. Now, it's also demonstrated that the coronavirus does spread through exhaled vapor, and that will happen because of the particles will be bound up with little bits of mucus and saliva. Now, whether that becomes exacerbated when vapor is exhaled, then certainly it's demonstrated that the bits of saliva in vapor go much further than if someone was normally talking or singing or anything like that. And also the force at which the vapor is exhaled is also goes over a greater distance, and that will go an even greater distance if that exhalation of the vapor is accompanied by a cough. So this is naturally caused concern. You know, if you're walking down the street and you're walking past someone who's merrily vaping away, you're going to get that cloud coming back. And there are some researchers say that there are serious concerns to the level that, to use an inelegant phrase, you know, it might be equivalent to someone spitting in your face. You know, it could be that serious. And scientists in China have used a mixture of numerical modelling and airflow simulations to kind of model the typical respiratory aerosol. And this is kind of in like doing those kind of slow motion turbulent jets to show what exhaled vapor is like. And they've also done things to sort of replicate, you know, typical indoor temperatures, humidity, to try and match the different velocities and so on. And they do show that if there were viral particles, then they would travel greater distances in these clouds. But equally, just to balance things out, there's equally other studies, and I think there's one from the University of New Mexico, which says that the risk of exhaled vapor is actually a negligible contagion factor, and that's linked to the actual viral load being relatively low. So there are different schools of thought, there are different levels of research, but personally, if I was walking down the street, I wouldn't want to get too close to someone who was vaping.
Right.
There's also some evidence that, again, linking back to the point we were talking about earlier about particular vulnerabilities, there are some research coming out that, again, people who smoke or vape may also be additionally vulnerable to the coronavirus. And there seems to be something strange going on that particularly nicotine causes the human lung cells to express in a slightly different way, making them more vulnerable, because the way the coronavirus infects, because it targets the lung cells, and the reason it's called the coronavirus is due to the kind of spike-shaped proteins that protrude around the edge, giving it like a crown appearance. And these are able to use that to latch onto the lung cells and then penetrate them. And it appears, it's still emerging research, that nicotine makes those lung cells more vulnerable to the virus attaching and then getting in and then replicating, and then the COVID-19 symptoms getting out.
Sure. So smokers have to be extra careful. It sounds like, even though there are still a lot of research going on, and it sounds like this is, definitely there are scientists on both sides of this argument, and we don't know for sure whether vaping or vapors from vaping are carrying the virus, but still masking and social distancing are important for folks. Especially if you're in proximity of someone vaping, I guess.
Yeah, and most vapors aren't wearing masks because they're vaping.
Exactly.
That's the challenge around that. So, more research will emerge, but personally, I would be a little cautious at this present time.
Very good. So, Tim, given all of these potential contamination risks, do you see the role of the clean room manager, which we discussed earlier at the onset of this episode, changing in response?
I think it does, but obviously it's a difficult. I can approach this from a very strict point of view to say, if you had a piercing, I want evidence that your ear has healed. If you've had a tattoo, I want you to wait 2 weeks and cover it up. You've got that side of things, and then obviously you've got the civil liberties aspect. People are free to have tattoos and piercings, and if it's not in their contract of work that they're not permitted to do that, or they may not tell, if they've got they've had a tongue piercing or a tattoo on a certain body. So I think it's really best with a kind of mentoring education approach to say to people who work in clean rooms that, there are certain risks around certain things, and, you're free to have those done, but we'd like you to be open and honest, and we'll find you alternative duties until these different conditions have appropriately healed up. So it's going to be a balance, but I think it's just opening the awareness, because this has not really been discussed in any detail before, and I think hopefully people may want to check out an article that we put together for IVT on this subject, and I think when Stacey and I were talking about this, we were saying that when we're putting the research together, no one's actually really written about this subject.
Right.
So it is quite novel, but it's also quite real. So I think a lot of clean room managers and people working in clean rooms may not have given this subject the sufficient degree of thought. And our society is changing. The number of people having tattoos is increasing, particularly amongst the younger generation.
Right.
Become issues that we have to grapple with.
Yeah, no, and I think it's fascinating, and we'll watch as perhaps more research emerges on the topic. But, and again, people working in clean rooms know there's a certain level of precaution that they need to take anyway in their work life. So, perhaps some of those things will just be a little bit more they'll be a little bit more diligent with some of those tasks, and we'll see as this whole topic evolves. But yeah. So, Tim, as we wrap up this very timely discussion, then, are there any last thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think, there's actually one thing I wanted to get in, because there's, first of all, there's a misapprehension, which I came across on social media. I think it was being tweeted, that if you vape, you're protecting yourself from coronavirus. Because it was a kind of a very unscientific argument that the vaping chemicals can increase the humidity in the lungs, and this can prevent viral infections, and that is complete nonsense. So if anyone reads that, don't take up vaping and think you're going to be immune to coronavirus. I think it's important to see piercings and tattoos as things that are physically damaging to the skin. I'm not passing judgment on whether you should have any of those or do that kind of thing, but you probably need to get in the mindset about go to somewhere that is legitimate. Don't go to the back street tattoo parlors if you can avoid it. Go to good ones. And then, consider it that it is a wound. So, do some basic wound care management, do a saline rinse, cover up it, wear a dressing for a period of time, and just be a little bit savvy about what's going on and the potential risks that you might be putting towards not just the clean room environment, but at the end of the day, the product and ultimately the patient.
For sure. Thank you. That's a great reminder for everybody who's considering a tattoo or a piercing. And of course, you have written on this topic as well as a blog on the e-cigarette and vaping topic. So we will share those links in the show notes for today's episode. And that way people can do a little follow-up research of their own.
Okay, yeah. Check them out.
Well, Thank you so much, Dr. Tim Sandle, for being with us today. It's great to have this novel idea presented and some more information by way of articles and blogs for people to look up. So thank you for being with us today. Also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued audience. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you about that. Just send us a quick message or an email. If you enjoyed the episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice. And don't forget to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. We do appreciate you helping us spread the good word. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great discussion. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.